This recording is a production of the Disaster Resilience Leadership Academy of Tulane University. Welcome to the Brown Bag Lunch Faculty Speakers Series. On January 31st, 2017, students gathered for a lunchtime conversation with Professor Rob Verchick, DRLA Senior Fellow and Academic Lead of the Environment and Infrastructure Pillar. Professor Verchick holds the Gauthier-St. Eminent Scholar Chair in Environmental Law at Loyola University and is an expert in climate change law, disaster law, and environmental regulation. In 2009 and 2010, Verchick served in the Obama administration as Deputy Associate Administrator for Policy at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In that role, he helped develop climate adaptation policy for the EPA and served on President Obama's Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force. In the fall of 2012, he researched climate adaptation policies in India as a visiting scholar at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, supported by a Fulbright Award. His work has appeared in many venues, including the California Law Review, the Southern California Law Review, and the environmental law journals at Harvard, Stanford, and Berkeley. He is an author of 3 books, including the award-winning Facing Catastrophe, Environmental Action for a Post-Katrina World from Harvard University Press.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rob Verchick with the Tulane Sterla. And we're going to have a bit of a talk today about some of the work that I've been doing and some of the talks that I've been giving, because Meredith was nice enough to ask me to do that. And I actually think it's a good idea for folks to know what different researchers are doing in DERLA and around. And one of the things to know about me is that, as you can see, I get affiliated or am affiliated with a number of institutions. And so that means I have a number of projects going on, and one of the things I'm trying to do is make sure that my projects are all about the same thing, so that I can do a lot of projects, but I'm not having to duplicate all of my efforts. I am a professor of law at Loyola. I'm also a senior fellow here at Tulane, and I teach the DERLA program. The other thing which will come into play a little bit later is that I am president of the board of a policy think tank called the Center for Progressive Reform, and we are actually doing a lot of work now having to do with changes in the regulatory process in the new administration. And so part of what Meredith billed this talk as is a talk about the Trump administration, and specifically about how changes in the executive branch of government might affect disaster policy, might affect environmental policy, might affect immigration policy. And I actually, for better or worse, know a fair amount now about that, because I've been talking to reporters nonstop for the last week about all of these issues. So we can talk about that too. What my plan is to maybe take 15, 20 minutes and talk about something I prepared, and then we can talk about anything we want to talk about that's related to any of those things. Hi, come on in.
Chair.
Last November and then in December, I was on in a number of presentations, and the talk I have here is developed from 2 of those, and I just want to tell you a little bit about each one. So the first program I was in was a symposium called Disaster Justice and the Anthropocene, which was at the National University of Singapore, which is one of a handful of top research universities in Asia. And the speakers were from many different disciplines, most of them in the social sciences. I was the only law person there. They wanted me to give the keynote, and what they essentially, from talking to them early on about this, what I realized is something that was quite surprising, is this entire symposium they were developing was around a particular paper that I had written in 2012, which was titled Disaster Justice. And the more I got to talking to them about that, I realized, and this is a lesson that you can learn, titles really matter. I was not the first person to invent the words disaster justice and put them together, but apparently I was one of the first people to put them in the title of any kind of an article, of an academic article. And so unknown to me, in many other disciplines, this piece was sort of floating around. And this piece actually had a fair amount of political theory in it and a fair amount of history about disaster studies, and pulling in a number of things I knew about environmental justice and the environmental justice movement, which I had studied as a lawyer and which I teach at the law school. And so I'll tell you a few of the ideas that came out of that keynote, but only to say you never know, right, when things are going to get traction. And as researchers, I think this is really important because, particularly early in my career, I tried really hard to be original and to be, say things that people would remember and to get an idea that would have traction. And the more and more I tried, the more elusive those things happened. And this last piece, this 2012 piece, was a piece where I was just truly trying to answer questions for myself that I had that I couldn't find answers to. And so keep doing that, right? Write for yourself in some ways, because chances are it's interesting to you if someone else is asking the same question somewhere else. The second piece that I talked about was based on that keynote address, but was at the World Bank. The World Bank every year does a forum on law, and this particular forum had a lot to do with environmental justice and climate justice and, yes, disaster justice. And it was a whole week of interdisciplinary groups there at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. But there were a lot of lawyers there and a lot of judges from around the world. And one of the things I really believe in is I think that law is undersold in many other academic areas for all kinds of reasons. I mean, the law professors don't necessarily read what anthropologists are writing or geographers are writing or what other social science experts are writing, and the same goes back and forth. But law is how you implement almost any idea that you think is a good one. And so no matter what idea you might have, whether it's about science or whether it's about people or whether it's about communication or whatever it is, it won't happen unless there is a legal structure that allows for it to happen, and probably that encourages it to happen. And so that's what I write about, is about how do we make other people's good ideas work in a legal structure, because if it's not in a legal structure, it won't happen. And I began learning about disaster studies and writing about disasters and climate change adaptation after Hurricane Katrina. I had been a law professor for almost 20 years before Hurricane Katrina, and it completely changed my career path. I had been in this city for 9 months with my family here, and afterwards, like a lot of people, had chances and opportunities to go other places because everybody was sort of scattered to the winds. My family was actually living in another place for a while. And we made the decision to come back to New Orleans because I really thought it was interesting. I liked the city a lot and I liked the people, but I thought that the issues here after Katrina were incredibly interesting. And that's when a friend of mine at Berkeley and I decided to write a casebook, a textbook, about disaster and law, because it didn't exist before. And that's the book I still teach from, and some of you have. And I guess my only point there is the other thing that you should do in your careers, I think, is be attentive to currents that you're feeling. We could have easily my family moved somewhere else and done the same stuff that I was already doing, writing about environmental justice and other kinds of environmental regulation. But we kind of took a chance, and we kind of said, well, this seems like something very interesting. I wonder if there's a new avenue in there. So we followed a current. We followed a current to see where it would go, and it's completely changed my entire professional career. I'm known for something internationally because of being in the wrong place at the wrong time here in New Orleans and asking questions about why it happened, and how you could keep things like that from happening in other places. And so I think that's really important. Again, it's things that you can't plan, but I think that one of the things that you can do is to be open to experience and to constantly ask questions that other people aren't asking. And that's really hard to do, I think. And sometimes it takes these real crisis moments. We may be in a moment of a very different kind of disruption here politically in the new presidential administration. And I think that that's actually opening up some interesting avenues for discussion and research, as unpleasant or as challenging or as frustrating as it might be. But going towards frustration is a good thing. You know, it's the same with working out in the gym, whatever it is, right? You know, you want to feel uncomfortable. That's when you start growing muscle or learning to do new things, and so on. So enough of that. This talk I'm giving was these are mainly slides I showed at the World Bank, and one of the things that the day I was there, they were focusing on climate change adaptation, preparing for climate change impacts in many parts of the world. And so the issue had to do with the Anthropocene, this idea that we're living in a world where, for better or worse, human footprints and fingerprints are absolutely everywhere. And so we are part of this world and directing, in many ways, the things that happen in this world, both from a social point of view and from an environmental point of view. And I was asked to talk about why some communities succeed in adapting to climate change and why others don't, and what the role of fairness and equality were in these issues. And so I put together a few cities that I wanted to look at that I had visited and taken part in some research having to do with. So in 2012, I was in India, some of you know, on a Fulbright, and I was studying different cities. And so I said, let me tell you about a particular city called Surat. And some of my students know, oh, that's not going to work. Let's see. Oh, it's not going to let me change my slides. Oh, I think it's commandeered my computer somehow. Let me see. Oh, maybe I have to keep that open. You don't mind. So Surat's right over there on the Arabian Sea, and you know, some of you I've seen have a diamond on your hands. All right, if you have a diamond, it was probably polished in Surat. There's an 80% chance. It's the diamond capital of the world. Almost every diamond moves into that city. It's also a huge textile. It's sort of the Manchester of India in terms of textiles. Almost anybody who has any sari, any shirt, anything in India has clothing from Surat. It's a huge magnet, the fastest growing city in the world. It also is really prone to floods because there's an important river that goes through there. And something really, really terrible happened back there in 1994. The plague broke out. The pneumonic plague broke out after a flood. And this completely disrupted everything in Surat. The business community went crazy because they were afraid they were going to lose all the immigrants who were coming into this place. A quarter of the people evacuated because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to leave the city after there was a quarantine. And the economy completely cratered. It hit the front pages of the New York Times. This pneumonic plague had broken out in India. This was bad, okay? And it's not the only thing bad that ever happened in Surat. In 2006, another sort of ginormous flood happens. 3/4 of the entire city underwater, 10,000 people displaced. This is a city that's crawling with slums everywhere. Many people dead. We don't even know how many. And what happened as a result of both of those things is that this city became very, very interested in resilience. After 1994, when the plague broke out, they brought in public health officials from all over the world to figure out what to do. The mayor of the city insisted that they plot many of the roads so that they could be larger. They instituted the first garbage pickup program in Surrey. There had never been a garbage pickup program before there. And they sent sweepers through the city to make sure that all the alleyways and everything were clean. In 2006, another thing came along, and that was the Rockefeller Foundation, a private foundation which is funding, I think, almost 30 different cities in Asia now for climate change resilience. I went to all 3 cities. There are 3 in India that Rockefeller's funding. Surrey is one of them, and now Rockefeller's trying to figure out why do some succeed and some don't. Surrey is actually one of the best news stories in the whole portfolio of Asian cities that the Rockefeller Foundation is looking at. So this is what Surrey looks like when I was there. It's actually quite a bustling city. For India, it's a very clean city. You would be hard-pressed, I think, to find a city that runs better in India than Surrey. And if you can see the wider streets and these sorts of things. So why does this work? Well, one of the things that we know is that the money stream that came into Rockefeller from Rockefeller was important. They came in, the Rockefeller Foundation, and said, we want to fund climate resilience. We want to fund cities adapting to climate change. And people looked around in Surrey, the Chamber of Commerce, which was very hooked in with those textile businesses and the diamond businesses, and the public health people who had been activated since 1994, who still maintain their networks, and they said, we want to get some of this money, but we don't know anything about climate change adaptation, and we actually don't care very much about climate change adaptation. But they decided they were going to. Right? They were going to take the existing projects that they had on the board, and they were going to classify them in a way. Now, many of these were on the books. Some of them weren't on the books, and this is just too complicated to describe everything that's going on. But essentially, in this portfolio of projects, which has been implemented, is a first-of-its-kind warning system for floods, because as it happens, there's a major dam that releases water outside the jurisdiction, and that creates the flash floods, all right? Because that dam fills up and it's going to flood the area where the dam is, and so they let it go. There never was any kind of a warning system that dam was going to open up. The other thing that happened is in the old days, when people in Surrey figured out that water was coming down the pike after it had been opened, they ran around in trucks with these makeshift loudspeakers, saying, everybody move, 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 saying in this loud sort of, the way trucks are, they've all kinds of these sorts of trucks for political campaigns and things around India. Nobody listened to it, nobody could hear it. So now they've got everything on cell phones and beepers, and yes, even people in slums have cell phones, right, which is another thing that India is working on. And so they have that, they have protocols for the dam release, they have a lot of things going on. One of the things that is really important about this story is the diamond industry. I actually went and visited one of these diamond factories, as they're called. And these are folks polishing diamonds, right? There are thousands of these people. The companies that hire them pay them very high wages and take care of their entire families. They even take the families on vacations. They pay for private schooling for the kids. They pay for retirement or nursing homes for the elderly people in these families. There's a lot of social cohesion. I'm not going to say it's all brilliant, right, because there's some things that you might find suffocating or oppressive about some of these relationships. But the idea is everybody understands this industry is what the city's based on. And the patriarchs in these systems, in these companies, take care of folks. This is a place where you can find people trading diamonds in the open streets and alleyways of Surrey. This is a place where a 12-year-old or 10-year-old boy scurrying around the city might have a pocket full of diamonds, taking it to someplace else. Very little crime in that kind of industry. Now, there's a lot of tax abuse and a lot of cash that's moving around that the government doesn't know about. Everybody was quick to tell me that. But my point is everybody watches everybody in this city, and they know things about each other. So this is a map, a GIS map meant to map social vulnerability in India. We have maps like this in the United States. Susan Cutter is one of the pioneers in the U.S. And I've written about these maps. And this is, I see, because the light won't shine. But this is a map that they duplicated in India, where they attempt to show who are the people who are living in low-income areas, who have low education. Right now, you can talk to leaders of emergency response in Surrey, and they can tell you who knows how to swim in the slums and who doesn't. They can tell you who has a boat and who doesn't. They can tell you what roofs to walk on top of so you don't fall in, right, when the water comes. They know these things. There's something called the Mosquito Fleet. 500 people are paid every day to go worm their way around these communities, talk to people, find out who's coughing, who has a fever, check standing water, check standing bowls, talk to people about mosquitoes. These folks are everywhere, every day in these cities. And it's this kind of social cohesion that really helps. Now, earlier on, I had written a piece called well, it's called Adapting to Climate Change, but it had footholds and rope lines in the subtitle. And the idea was that it seemed to me that one of the things that's important, two things are important in adapting to climate change. One is having what I call footholds, which is having either initiatives or laws that, although they might not have been meant for the thing that you're interested in, can be used for that. Right? It's a way, I used to mountain climb, it's a way of sort of stuffing your toe into a piece of ice to get some kind of purchase, some kind of traction, right? And it doesn't matter that it wasn't meant for you as long as you can use it somehow. And then the other thing you need is a rope line. You need to be able to bring networks of people together so that if you need the public health people, you can bring them in. If you need to know who's living in the slums and under what conditions, you have people who have those connections. Another city that I have written about is a very different one, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. When I was at the EPA, I was in the Obama administration working on climate adaptation issues. And we decided at the EPA that we wanted to figure out if we could be helpful in helping cities adapt to climate change. So EPA has a small budget, no matter what you hear in the news, right? It's about $8 billion a year. Half of that goes to the states. We don't give out a lot of money, and because we don't give out a lot of money, we don't have a lot of traction with how communities spend money. But there was another agency that did have a lot of traction, and that was FEMA. Because when FEMA helps a city recover, it can institute best practices. So we entered an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, memorandum of understanding with FEMA, and we said, can we work with you to develop climate change adaptation protocols, and you can sneak those in your conditions. And they said yes. And so as a pilot project, we went down. I was down in Cedar Rapids sometime after this flood and met with city leaders. And we went to the city and the state people, and we said, well, what do you have in terms of land use that could provide footholds? And it turns out they had, the state has a law requiring, or actually I think it's encouraging, comprehensive plans for each city. And the cities themselves have zoning ordinances. And we said, well, can we come in and create networks? Can we connect you with scientists who are already in your state who know about climate change and people who are monitoring water flow in your state who know about climate change? And can we hook these people up? And at first they didn't want to talk about climate change because it's Iowa, right? And so we said, okay, we don't have to talk about climate change. Let's talk about the precipitation patterns that have been increasing over the last 10 years. Let's talk about, let's talk about $250 million you're going to spend on your storm drains in the next 10 years. Do you want those to work beyond the next 10 years? Right? You're going to build them for 50 years. They're probably going to be there for 100 years. Do you want them to work? Right? If you do, let's connect you. And we started to do things like this, and this turned out to be a kind of a success. Now, some of you know from my class, we've been talking about another community that I'll just bring up, Ile de Jean Charles, which has a tribal community on it, the Biloxi Chitimacha. They've gotten a grant from HUD, a resilience grant of $40+ billion, and their idea is to relocate. They are lacking, I think, some of the factors of success in these other communities. Some of them they have and some of them they don't. What they have are some good networks. The reason they won this proposal, and there were many other tribal communities vying for the same pot of money, the reason they won is because they have excellent connections with these UNO professors who built a nonprofit called the Lowlanders Center, and they helped them build this proposal, which is a first-class proposal. One of my students, a former student of mine, is working at HUD and vetted the projects that were going forward in this process. And she said they had, by far, the best proposal because they had experts who were already embedded in those communities and already knew how that community worked and were really willing to help. What they don't have is very good networks in other ways, and we can talk later on about that, but one of the issues is that they are not a federally recognized tribe, and so what that means is they have to go through the state and they have to go through other governmental processes, and if they don't have clear networks moving around, sometimes it's going to be much harder for them. They do have the funding, right? So that's a good start. This is a picture of a community that they would like to build on the new property if they locate. We talked in my class earlier about another village. There's a tribal village, Newtok, which is in Alaska. There are dozens of villages that are tribal in Alaska that are in need of moving because of climate change. And this is one of them. Newtok also applied for that grant and didn't get it. They very recently, in the last days of the Obama administration, wrote a request asking for President Obama to declare Newtok a major disaster area based in part on the melting of the permafrost. It was a historical request because it was the first request that I think anybody knows of in which the force behind the damage was climate change. And it was a slow-acting force of melting permafrost. That had never happened before. The president denied the request. So villages like Newtok are still looking for help, for help in terms of understanding the problem, for help in terms of locating money, for help in terms of developing networks. It doesn't help that villages like this are so geographically removed, right? And the people who live in these communities are very culturally removed in many ways because their economies are subsistence economies. I was actually at a conference in Honolulu, believe it or not, in which several members of Alaska Native tribes were present. We were all talking about climate relocation. We had people from the Marshall Islands, we had people from the Arctic Circle, we had the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw from Louisiana. We were all in Honolulu, and this was paid for by a Sea Grant. I don't want you to think these folks have much money because they don't, but it was funded by the White House, the Obama White House, and funded by Sea Grant of Alaska Hawaii, and they were all there to basically share their stories. It was a kind of networking, but it's hard to do, right? It's hard to do because these places are so far flung. So what works? Well, the Rockefeller Foundation and other social scientists have been following those Asian cities I told you about. And essentially what works are four things that all start with the N sound. I had to fudge one, right? Networks are really important. Networks of people and experts. And these are networks from local government all the way to the high levels of national or federal government, and also multi-sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, environmental, immigration. All of these groups have to be working together. That's enormously hard to do in a bureaucracy. The Obama administration actually pushed agencies really hard to do that work, with some success and with some failure. But it doesn't happen naturally. I mean, look at any big institution, Tulane, Loyola, any large company that you might have ever worked in. What does it take to get two people in two departments to get on the phone and talk to each other about something? The Army or the military, I mean, you know this, right? It is hard. You need to get a visa to go into somebody else's office sometimes, and it is a problem. It's not just a joke. It's a problem, and you have to think seriously about how you fix those problems. Knowledge is another thing. Nobody at FEMA knew anything about climate change adaptation when we started our work. I thought that was kind of remarkable, right? I talked to people at Homeland Security who said, well, all we do is fight terrorists. Right? I talked to a high-up person who said, all we do is fight terrorists. I said, FEMA is within Homeland Security. Oh, yeah, that's FEMA. So this is the kind of thing that happens in Washington, D.C., right? And so getting knowledge to people is really important. When I was at EPA trying to develop a climate adaptation program for our agency, I found workers at EPA who didn't know anything about climate adaptation either. They knew a lot about reducing greenhouse gases, but they didn't know very much about climate change adaptation. And that's fine, right? That is going to happen. Now ideas are, that's an Indian friend of mine uses that term. Now ideas are ideas you've already got on the back burner somewhere and you want to activate them. You can't go into a town and try to get them to do something that they haven't thought of doing first. Right? You've got to find whatever it is that you're interested in doing and then try to make that a foothold. Right? By going in and say, will you try something completely new that you never wanted to do before? It doesn't happen. Okay? And new funds, really essential. I mean, that's what nobody wants to hear, but it's really essential. You can't use old money to solve new problems in that way. Or another. Oh.
I don't know why. Okay, could catch it.
Yeah, it looks like it's
yeah,
making
it. Yeah, it looks like it's fine.
Okay. What made the beginnings of that piece I told you about in 2012 was a woman named Judith Shklar, whom you may not know, but in the 80s she was quite a deal. She was a political theorist, and I still really love Judith Shklar. A friend of mine studied with her, and that's the only reason I was sort of yeah, she could smoke a cigarette. She wrote a wonderful book called The Face of Injustice, and she borrows a lot from ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And some of you know I really like Rousseau because he was the first social scientist of disaster when he wrote about the Lisbon earthquake. He was one of the first person we have who ever wrote anything about that from a socialized point of view, a disaster as being a socialized event. She wrote about disasters in a lot of her theory, but people don't really think of her in terms of disaster, although earthquakes are all over her writing. And then I started looking at Amartya Sen, another philosopher that I really like, a political philosopher, who writes a lot about famines to make points. They're not writing about disaster, but when they want to make an important point, they'd say, oh, what if there were an earthquake? What if there were a famine? Blah, 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 blah. You know, Amartya-Sen famously said, there's never been a famine in a working democracy. And he's right. He's right. There were several famines in India under British rule, but not one after independence. And so his point about that is that accountable government matters. Accountable government matters because people will make sure certain things don't happen if they have access to political power. Anyway, Judith Scholar raised this question about what's the difference between misfortune and injustice, and can we call what happens in disasters injustice? Now, I think there's a difference depending on how you frame it, right? If it's just misfortune, you can get out of helping, right? You can say, oh, I'm not feeling charitable today, or I don't have any money today, or I've got other things to do today. You know, hit me up next time. If it's injustice that we're talking about, that is, if there is some role that government played in setting the problem up, and you can phrase it as justice, then you get more traction for your problem. You get more traction for your problem. And Mary Wollstonecraft that I put up here is not just, I mean, in part it's because this is a wonderful phrase, it's justice, not charity, wanting in the world. But one of the things that Judith Scholar points out, and she's right, is that for generations and generations in the United States, when courts would deny rights to women, they would frame it as misfortune. And they would actually say things like, it's not my fault this person was born a woman. If she had not been born a woman, she would be able to sign a legally binding contract. Right? Now you look at that today and you say, well, that's completely misframed, right? It's not misfortune, it's injustice, right? And so it's that way of moving back and forth. And the fact that Judith Scholar was sort of raising this issue was just really cool. You know, that you can frame things in different ways. Is it your fault that you were born in this country, in this circumstance, with this amount of money, or whatever, or is there something else in there, right? So that just brings me, you know, essentially to the very end, which is the Anthropocene, this planet that we have our footprints all over. And one of the things about this idea of the Anthropocene being in a place where the human beings have essentially created what's there is that we can create what is going to be there. We can't get out of it. We are part of the planet. We used to think that nature just worked on its own. That was an idea from the Enlightenment. You wind the world up and it just goes. In the Enlightenment, we also had thinkers who said you just wind the economy up and it goes. Right? But what we found out is that we're part of this planet, and what the planet will become has to do with what we do. Just in the same way, we are part of this economy. And the choices we make about this economy have to do with what the economy is going to look like. So we are the world that, I mean, we invent the world that we're going to inhabit. And that's tremendous responsibility. We don't know what it's supposed to look like because it's not supposed to look like anything. You know, economies aren't supposed to look like anything. They're going to look like what we want them to look like. And what we want them to look like is going to depend on our values, which is why I think the humanities belong in disaster resilience, just like anything else, because we need to know what we want. And in a democratic society, what we want is a product of political debate. Every day we wake up in the morning, we're part of a debate or part of a discussion about what we want the world to look like. And so I will leave it there, and but I hope that you will approach your studies in this way, in thinking about what is it that you want the world to look like, and how can you make space for that kind of solution, right? For that kind of world, because it's up to you and me. It's not anybody else at this point. Okay, I'll leave it there. And I'll answer questions about anything you want.
Anything.
Anything I know about, things I don't know about.
Anything. As you mentioned before, anything.
What do you want the world to look like?
What do I want the world to look like? You know, when I write about this, what I tend to prescribe are institutions that allow for the public to make decisions that they want. So the things that I push are more procedural, but they have to do with access to the discussion and fairness. You know, access, fairness, because I think that you know, what I would hope is that we want a world that has a stable climate, that we want a world where people are treated fairly and can have the means to build and live lives that they have reason to value. So I suppose that's what I want, but I don't want to impose it on anybody. I want institutions to allow people to make those decisions for themselves.
Within the United States, we're having a fight for, is climate change real? Naysayers. Is that also in the global community also, or is that pretty much just in the United States?
It's a really good question, and I've talked to a lot of people about it. We actually have a fair amount of empirical research on this. The answer is that the U.S. is pretty much an outlier in this, not a complete outlier. So there's some studies, for instance, that show that there's a bit of climate skepticism in Norway, right, of all places, in part because Norway is a powerhouse for oil and gas. And there's a lot of psychological theory out there which suggests a phenomenon called solution aversion, which is that if you think the solution to a problem is adverse to your interests, you are less likely to see the problem. And I think that there's a lot of research that sort of shows that's right. In fact, there are studies in the U.S. where if you show conservatives two different storylines about climate, one storyline says, oh, and you know, windmills and solar panels will help save this problem, and along with world cooperation. And then you have another story that says, oh, we can make a big dent in this problem with nuclear power. The people who read the second article, the conservatives who read the second article, much more likely to believe in climate change after that, right? With everything else the same. So in India, everybody believes in climate change, I'll tell you. But in India, they all blame the United States for climate change, right? So that's an easy one for them. It's an easy one for them. I think that at this point, we are the only country that I know of whose leader does not believe in climate change. So that does make us an outlier.
Have you worked with the sea level rise viewer?
Yeah.
That I talked to? And because it's such a dramatic showing of people get to see it for themselves.
Yeah, you're talking about the NOAA interactive map, which still is on the website, although my friends at NOAA wonder how long it's going to be on the website. The one criticism, and it's not so much a criticism, it's a limitation of the NOAA map, is that it shows, and I don't know if you know about this, but you can pick the map and you can see what 1 foot of sea level rise, 2 feet of sea level rise will be. The limitation of the map is it doesn't incorporate surge. It's not intended to. That's a more complicated problem. But I was down, for instance, in Gainesville, Florida, working on a sea level rise scenario planning exercise where we were told that a foot of sea level rise is a huge deal in Florida because with surge, that surge can go in 20 miles in addition to what it normally would. So that's giant, and that's something you wouldn't even know by looking at the NOAA map because it's static water.
That's not shown on the inundation map?
Not incorporating local modeling.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Does it incorporate historic maps also? Like, has there been an encroachment already?
Oh, there absolutely has been an encroachment. Yeah.
Does it include that?
I think it does.
Well, maps,
I saw one of
they include
USGS
yeah.
historic.
Mm-hmm. And incidentally, those maps, when I say, oh, I hope that they're still online, there are cities around the country that rely on that information to make choices about their own local land use decisions. And so if those maps are no longer available, that's a huge loss. And so I have a friend at Georgetown who runs the Climate Law Center at Georgetown, and they are in the midst of vacuuming up and storing as many tools and interactive maps as they can, and their plan is to make those available from the Georgetown website. University of Pennsylvania is doing something similar. There are a number of groups that are trying to run their rogue websites if these things actually get taken.
Can you speak to the current political situation? Because that was something that you mentioned in the beginning.
Yeah. What do you want me to say? What do you want to know?
I guess what you're hearing right now in terms of how it's going to play out for FEMA, for the EPA, any changes that are coming down the pipe?
Well, I have to think about this because, in part, people really don't know. I mean, I was just in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, and I was talking to friends of mine who are either long-time career people at EPA, for instance, or at the time I was there, we were still in the Obama administration, so I was talking to some politicals who were on their way out, and trying to get information about what people think. And what I think it is safe to say that one of the reasons people have a hard time predicting what agencies are going to do is because it doesn't seem like there's much of a plan in place, to tell you the truth. The transition teams this one is moving very, very slowly, and that is a problem for an administration that wants to get things done. When I was at EPA in the Obama administration, we were essentially, I was there very early on, and we were told that you have 6 months to develop the policy, you have another 12 months to get all the policy in place that you want, and then the rest of the time, even if you're looking at a 2-term president, the rest of the time is going to be protecting what you did in those first 18 months, because that's how politics works now. And so speed is extremely important. And I think that one of the things that is lacking in the Trump administration is this kind of organizational structure within the agencies. So, inertia is a counterweight, probably, within the Trump administration to some of the things that he might want to do. On the other hand, there aren't many other counterweights in the executive branch right now. I mean, I think that the way Bannon is consolidating power is that I think you really can't rely on the heads of agencies, whether you like them or not, or whether you think they might be more traditional or more cautious. I don't think they are going to be counterweights to this White House. So I think it is probably true that people in the executive branch will be able to get done in the executive branch whatever that they want to do. I think that the counterweights are going to be Congress and the courts. And there are some significant things I don't think Trump will be able to do. I think rolling back regulations to any sizable amount is going to be very, very hard because of the courts. Because anytime you undo a regulation, it takes another regulation to undo a regulation. I just heard there was a report out this morning that White House officials are debating whether or not to rescind something called the Endangerment Finding, which sounds like it's in the weeds, but the Endangerment Finding is a scientific document that EPA developed in the Obama administration to justify reducing carbon. In other words, it's a particular scientific finding that climate change is human-caused and that it's bad. All right. The argument now, or the discussion going on in the White House, is they can undo that. And apparently, what Abel is saying is we can redo that, put in more science, as he says, and make the conclusion that climate change is happening, but it is mainly good. I'm not kidding, right? And that with that new finding, you could undo lots of regulations that way and justify it with the science. I happen to think that's nuts. I mean, just in terms of a strategy, it seems to me it's nuts, because I can't imagine any court, even a conservative court, approving of whatever kind of scientific document would purport to say that climate change is, on balance, a good thing for the United States, right? But those are the kinds of discussions going on, and he could, for all I know, essentially tell the EPA that's what he wanted them to do, and if they did it, you'd have you'd have court cases about it.
Have you heard anything about restructure within FEMA or OFTA or Homeland Security?
No, I haven't, and that's interesting to me, because some people would like to see FEMA outside of Homeland Security. I guess I don't. I see the administration mainly as working from a point of view of doing things that are intended to send signals rather than accomplish a particular practical goal. And so I don't see any signal I don't see any signal-based reason for reorganizing Homeland Security.
It's not on the radar.
So I assume it's not on the radar. I have heard, though, I'll tell you one thing. You may know this, in the Bigger Waters Act, the part that survives, that there is a requirement that FEMA use the most accurate elevation data in its upcoming flood maps. And the Obama administration had interpreted that to mean that they had to use evidence or information, scientific information about projected climate conditions in the future. In other words, they had to put climate change into the maps. And I have already heard from people at FEMA that there's some discussion about whether FEMA is going to continue to put climate change adaptation into its flood maps.
We're co-leads with them in Red Cross.
Okay.
And we do that. We've been putting climate change maps into where we put our resources on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether that's being pushed out by FEMA and us, our discussions with them, because sometimes we do things separate of them. I'm not really entirely sure, but we've already been doing that, especially in Louisiana. But, some of that's going to have to be relooked at after the flood, what we had here. It's a little bit different. You can't necessarily use a climate change map to tell us something, but I told one guy, I said, water falls at the lowest point, wherever it is, whether it's a climate change falling or, inundation, I don't know.
Yeah.
So, we're already doing that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big deal, because as you know, that could be a 500-year floodplain becomes a 100-year floodplain.
Exactly.
And that's a big deal for developers, right?
The whole thing around the immigration and sanctuary cities.
Yeah.
And Trump basically saying that any sanctuary city that's unwilling to comply will not get federal funding. Do you think any of that pertains to disaster support, or?
Oh yeah, it could. I mean, depending how expansive they make it. What's interesting about that, from a legal point of view, is that there are some legal decisions that were made during the Obama administration that were championed by conservatives that have made Trump's argument harder. So, for instance, if you think of the Affordable Care Act, the way that the Affordable Care Act was written when it was passed was that it required states to expand Medicaid. And then there was a case that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court that said you can't require states to do this. They have to elect to do it on their own. And the way it was written in the Affordable Care Act was it said a state had to expand Medicaid or it would lose its federal funding that it relied on for lots of things. And the court basically said you can't take money away from, you can't hold states hostage in that way by taking a large sum of money away to force them essentially to do something. You may not coerce a state in that way. And at the time, progressives were like, I can't believe, that we should be able to tell states how they use their money. And the conservatives, like that argument. And to this day, that's why some states haven't expanded Medicaid, because of that Supreme Court decision. But that same Supreme Court decision, which came from a conservative court, now could be used to challenge the administration's threat to take money away, right? So particular money away from things that are not directly related to immigration. That's actually related to gun law too. I mean, in an odd way. There's a case early on where essentially Democrats pushed through a law. This was the Brady bill that required local law enforcement officials to provide information about gun sales to the federal government by essentially pushing a button on a computer and sending the information. Went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. A conservative court said federal government cannot tell local officials what to do, right? Because it's a states' rights issue. Progressives went all apoplectic about that because they thought pushing a button was such a small thing. But that was a conservative court pushing federalism. Now we have a situation where the Trump administration is upset because there are local officials who won't enforce federal immigration law. Well, that is more than just pushing a button. That's actually telling state officials where they need to go, what they need to do, who they need to detain, all of those kinds of things. And it seems to me that's a very clear violation of that federalism idea. I mean, you live by the sword, you die by the sword, And if the point is the federal government can't tell local officials what to do, that's the law in whether you're a conservative or a liberal.
In your legal understanding, is the executive order to hold immigrants out of the United States constitutional?
Well, that's obviously being argued a lot right now. I mean, it seems to me that it's got a number of legal weaknesses. Some constitutional, some statutory. There's actually a statute that makes it illegal for immigration to be based on state origin from a 1960s law that's still in effect. And there are also arguments under the Equal Protection Clause and under that arguably you can't do that. I think the strongest argument, the strongest constitutional argument is the one based on the First Amendment, because you do have what seems to me pretty literally a preference being expressed for Christians rather than or actually, it's a preference for Christians rather than for Muslims. And it seems to me that's clearly unconstitutional under the First Amendment. But that's only part of the order issue,
I was wondering if we could, sorry if I'm hogging someone else. You've got a broad scope of knowledge. Where do you decide, or what makes you decide what to read?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's actually a really good question. You know what? I started reading Breitbart News.
I was going to ask.
And I'm not joking. I started reading it.
It's reading what?
So,
Breitbart News.
Like the
so why?
Fulbright.
You have to understand.
I never looked at it, and it scares me to death. But there are people that only read that. right? And if that's what, and you know what, when I read that and I put out of my head all the other things that I know, and I just read that, it makes sense. It makes sense. I'm a guy who grew up in Nevada, right? This is one of my superpowers. So I grew up in Nevada with plenty of relatives who live in places called Pahrump and Ely and Searchlight and all of these things. And so I know these people, and they know what they know, you know. So to be slightly more serious, so I read the New York Times. I read Vox because I think Vox is doing a really good job at sort of trying to bring some empirical stuff in. I read some left things. I read Mother Jones and I follow Amy Goodman. But I don't watch Fox, but I do look at Breitbart and I do read the Wall Street Journal, you know, which is, but I'm like you. I mean, I can't spend my whole day.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, some days I do, but those are very few and far between. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So what do you have planned for the immediate future? What are you working on?
What am I working on? I'm working on a book on climate change adaptation for Popular Press, and anything I work on, including these things I tell you about, have to go into a chapter or I don't do them. That's basically what I said, right? And so actually there are a couple of chapters that were in here, and India, I got a chapter on India and a chapter on different things, and so I'm working on that, and I'll be working on that over the summer. I'm actually doing some scuba diving in Florida, where I'm going to be looking at some marine sanctuaries, and that's for writing about federal protected waters and climate change. So I'm going to have some people show me about efforts to repopulate reefs and things like this. And then next semester or next year, I'll be teaching a course here for one semester, and then I'll be at Yale University for the remaining semester, and I'll be teaching and also working with some folks on climate change adaptation issues, and hopefully finishing up my book when I'm there.
Crazy cool.
Crazy cool. Well, thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed it. You're good. Yeah. See you.
We'll see you tonight.
See you tonight.
Flowers.
Yeah.